This is The Meaningful Way. I'm your host, Luke Iorio. There are times in our lives when we face what appears to be a daunting task, where the odds and enormity of what we're taking on just seem too great. It can be in relation to our health, to our finances, careers, relationships, whatever it is, but it just at times seems insurmountable. It's not that we haven't tried. In fact, we've tried to make the change over and over again. We've tried and we've come up short, making the change seem even all the more out of reach. And yet, we see these stories, these inspiring and motivating stories of people who have made that change. They've stuck with it against the odds. And thankfully, some of them turn around to lend a hand to the next one in line. And we're joined by one such individual today. My guest today, Bryan Falchuk. He went from being obese and depressed to running marathons. He's faced nearly losing his wife to illness while their young son watched. He became a vegan in just one day. He got his master's from a top school and rose to a senior executive position in a successful business. He's transformed his life and developed an approach to help others do the same that he teaches in his best-selling book, Do a Day. And that's what I've asked him to come onto the podcast, onto this episode, and share that philosophy with all of you. Bryan, thanks for so much for coming to The Meaningful Way.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Luke. That's a great intro.
Maybe there's just the place to start is let's talk a little bit about the background, meaning prior to kind of developing and discovering the do-a-day approach that we'll get into throughout the course of our conversation today. What was life like before that, the formative years and back then?
No, so I mean that's a really crucial piece to this, and that's I share a lot of that in the book. I try to be really honest about things that I've gone through, and not to go too far back, but it starts when I was a really little kid, and like a lot of people, I grew up in a family that was coming apart in divorce. So I was the youngest of four, and my parents got divorced when I was maybe 5 or 6. And, little kids don't really understand how to face those emotions. And there's a lot that they're feeling, and, a parent's moving out, and there's a lot of arguing. It's a lot for a little kid to experience. And I turned to something that was really comforting and wasn't yelling and wasn't moving out and never judged me. And that was food. And the more I turned to it, the more I turned to it. So it became a vicious cycle, and my weight just started going up and up. And that led to more negative feelings. Then I started to get judged for how I look and the choices I was making and how I was gaining weight, the health consequences of it. So that just led me to want to eat more because the food wasn't making fun of me and wasn't, judging me or anything. So it really spiraled out of control to the point that the last time I weighed myself was in 8th grade, and I was 248 pounds. And I continued to gain weight after that because my pant size kept going up. But I just couldn't face it, So I don't know how large I got. Somewhere I'm guessing around 260, but I don't know for certain. But it was about 100 pounds overweight. And that was really difficult. And it just kept being this impossible thing for me to face. That, I'd have these talks with myself. I can remember like getting ready for school in the morning being like, all right, that's it. No more. You're not going to eat that stuff. You're going to do differently. And of course, an hour later, I'm eating a donut or eating too much of something, just the pep talks and the grit and self-restraint, that just was never enough. And I was really lucky to have the head of the physical education program at my school took it really seriously. I think that's kind of a cop-out sport at most schools. And he used it as an opportunity to introduce people to wellness in a way that they could accept into their lives themselves. So he taught you how to care about your physical situation and to find things that you liked that would contribute to your wellness instead of forcing you to do exercises or to do things that you just didn't like, which had been my experience to date.
And I wanted to ask you to go a little further with that, because when I remember reading about, it was Mr. Andre, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And so one of the things just before you got into that, you prefaced and you used such a key phrase that jumped out to me that's so important, is that, yes, this was a part of time that kind of paved the way to what would become the do-a-day approach and kind of shift. But you said to truly change, you need to change your story. and that Mr. Andre and that period of time was the beginning of you changing your story. And I was hoping you could just say a little bit more about what do you mean by, change your story, and what were some of those seeds that were being planted so that you could later on go ahead and do so.
Yeah. I love that you honed in on a few key things in the book, and that's one of the first like epiphanies that I had. And it wasn't enough to change everything, but I started to understand, like, the reason why I was making the choices I had made was ultimately how I felt and how I saw myself. So, it was the emotion around the divorce, and, how did I judge myself for that? I was the youngest of four, and I was the marriage saver baby, and it didn't work. So, I'm sure I didn't understand that as a little kid, but I certainly understand it now. It's like I failed in my first mission. Of course, I didn't sign up for that one, but that was pretty definitional. So all of these points of failure and this judgment I was getting from everyone was about, like, I'm not good enough, and I look a certain way, and I make bad choices. And so I had a very negative and counterproductive self-framing. And that was my story. And what Mr. Andre did, and I know if he ever hears this, he'll be so uncomfortable that he's getting any credit, because it's just not the kind of person he is. I still argue with him about it today. But he helped me see, like, he never treated me that way. And every other coach or, physical fitness interaction I had was a very, like, come on, fat kid, get moving. Yeah. You're lazy. You're not going fast enough. I remember in summer camp, we had an inter-camp or intra-camp track meet, and the counselors thought it'd be so funny. They pitted all of the fattest kids in camp against each other in an 880-yard run, and it was like 105 degrees in blazing sun in Maine, super humid, and I made it to the end. I think I was probably last. I don't remember exactly, but I passed out, and next thing I know, I was awake. Yeah. I was waking up in the lake, like the camp lake, because my temperature had gotten so high that I basically succumbed to the heat, and they were trying to revive me. It's like that's what my story was. That's what my interaction with wellness was. And here was this guy who, I don't know how old he is. He was probably in his 40s. He has the body of like an 18-year-old, even to this day. And he's, that was a while ago. I think he has like 3 gray hairs now. But he's this epitome of health. And my expectation was this guy's going to look at me and it's going to be pure judgment. And he just, he never came with that approach. And it was like this awakening, like, oh, maybe I'm not so terrible. Maybe I can be exposed to these things without it being about my failure. Yeah. And that was the context that he was teaching me about it. And that word story, like my story was different when I was with him. And he taught me how to believe that myself.
The 2 things that I want to pull out of there for everybody. Number one is that, use Mr. Andre as the example, somebody who'd be really uncomfortable getting that type of, the accolades, any recognition for the impact that he did have. But to recognize when we are in that mentor or role model type of moment, and it may be an extended relationship over a period of time, or it may be something very, very brief. But when you extend non-judgment, extend acceptance to somebody else, even if it is just for that moment, it has a tremendous impact on who that person is and what they've connected to with you. So just please keep that in mind when you're interacting with everybody in your lives. The other thing that I'd love, Bryan, for you to share a little bit more on is, you talk about this idea of, we know, and we're trying to break this idea of being subject to the judgment of others as well as judging ourselves. And we want to break that pattern. And at the same time, it's one thing to say it. It's another to actually do it. What I did hear a little bit of, and I just wanted to see what else you would add to this, was I heard a little bit was that you gained recognition, whether it was in the moment or afterwards, you gained recognition to the fact that these interactions with Mr. Andre were different. And you started to focus on, acknowledge, be more aware of the times that were more like the story you wanted to have versus the story that you wanted to leave behind. And I was wondering what else you may add to that in terms of what was helpful to you in ultimately leaving, to any degree, some of that self-judgment behind.
Well, that's a really deep question that I'm pretty sure I wasn't aware of at the time. But what I was aware of is I had never desired to be exercising. And I use that word desire on purpose. It's kind of a weird word to use in this context, but I found myself after like probably the second class, because the first one was more just sort of setting things up. I was very sore, so I had delayed onset muscle soreness for probably like the first time in my life. But I was like, this is different. This is kind of fun. And I remember like I would always dread whatever the sport was for the day, and like, oh, I've got a stomach ache, or, you know, whatever excuse I could come up with. And this one was like, I remember I kept looking at my watch to see when that period was where the bell would ring, and then I go walk to the gym to go change and do PE. And that was a really weird feeling for me, but I was at least aware of like, this is different. I've never desired to do this before. And it wasn't the physical activity. It was the pull of like, I was aware that there was something going on here, something more positive, something different. I felt good being around him. He was celebrating what, you know, I would have expected other people to be like, that's all you did. And he was constantly like, you know, with this really heavy French accent, like, that's amazing. Excellent work. You're incredible. He'd always say, you're incredible, man. The funny thing is he was so positive. If something was bad, you'd never hear him use those words. He would just say, that's not good. And if it was really bad, he'd say, oh, no, that's not good at all. But I literally never heard him say bad in the 4 years that I was with him in school. And since then, he just doesn't frame things that way. And it's like your point on the non-judgment. Non-judgment's very, very disarming. You know, even against an adversary, it may take a few iterations, but it actually gets them to let down their guard and to drop the attack. And it's almost his approach to life more holistically, is he's non-judgmental of life. So there's nothing bad going on. There's a desire for betterment. It's a minor but really powerful difference.
Absolutely. It is a powerful difference. And to be that to have that kind of a non-judgment, or I'd even say almost a non-resistance to life, to be able to go with and work with the energy as opposed to constantly fighting it, is a really, really powerful sentiment. And then I know we'll talk a bit more about it, but part of what you just highlighted, which I want everybody to be aware of, is that you were mindful, even if you didn't know exactly what was going on, you were mindful of something that seemed to be a positive direction for you. And I want to just encourage everybody to use that mindfulness. Be aware of what are the things that seem like they're expanding you, leading you to a better sense of self, and whatever that better way is for you. And just to be mindful of that, those are the things you do want to lean into. So Bryan, if we fast forward a little bit, and you go through kind of that health and weight roller coaster that so many of us know only too well, of kind of getting healthy, putting it back on, getting healthy, putting it back on. But what was that turning point? Because you went through some very, very serious health challenges, not only for yourself, but for your wife. And tell us about what was that turning point and what did it open you up to?
Yeah. So I came out of college in pretty good shape still, and like a lot of people, especially a lot of college athletes, and then they wake up in their middle years with kids and house and job and all those responsibilities and all this extra weight. It's really interesting to me how many college athletes end up overweight. And it's just, life happens and you don't make the right priority calls and you're tired, and it is very much a spiral. And so for me, I had gotten up to 222 by the summer of 2011. So I was, I wasn't at my heaviest weight, and I didn't look obese anymore. I looked American. Like I looked like anybody else. No one really questioned it. But the reality is, I was not at a healthy weight, and more importantly, I was not a healthy mindset. So my motivations for losing weight the first time were about overcoming this judgment pattern that I was in. And a lot of that was based on outward judgment from others, whether that was real or in my head. And it wasn't about something deep within me. And that was the real difference. So as my life changes, those outward motivations weren't good enough anymore. And of course, people weren't judging me, and I was aware that they weren't judging me. So whether it was me creating it or actual judgment, that ceased. Well, that means I no longer had my motivation. And so slowly but surely, the wrong choices and priorities start to set in. So in 2011, my wife has a chronic illness, which really came out at this point. So she has chronic Lyme disease. We didn't know what was going on. She had one of her flare-ups that she'd had for basically most of her whole life, that no one could ever explain. They always thought she just had some stomach bug or maybe a 24, 48-hour virus or flu. Right. So she had one of these flare-ups. I took a day off from work. Our son was 2 at the time. And I was just like, we just need to get through a couple days and then she'll turn around because that's the pattern. And 2 days goes by and nothing changes. Actually, she's getting worse. And so then I start to take a couple more days off and still nothing changes. And after a week and a half, we're like, all right, something is very wrong here. And so we started this series of doctor's visits. No one could figure out what was going on. There was a lot of, well, you're sure you're not just depressed? And it's like, well, of course she's depressed. How would you feel? But she really wasn't before that. And there just, no one could stop it. It got to the place where she had lost about 20 pounds. There wasn't much more weight on her to lose. She was bedridden. I was now working from home. I was very lucky to have a boss who was able to give me some flexibility. So I'm home full time, taking care of our son and her and trying to work. And there's basically no path to recovery that anyone has. And they're all just sort of like not treating us like there's nothing real going on. Like she's doing this on purpose. And her primary care physician was going on a 6-week vacation and just said, well, just check in with me when I'm back. And I'm like, she doesn't, do the math here. She's losing 2 pounds a day. She doesn't have 6 weeks. And his response was, oh, well, then take her to the ER. And I was just like, how do you not care? Something is very, very wrong. And if you think she's just depressed, why aren't you doing something to help with that even? You're just sort of saying like, get over it and move on and stop it. And that's not helpful. So I was not happy in my life in general. I wasn't thrilled with myself physically. While I had that flexibility in my job, I didn't like my job overall. There's a lot of politics and backstabbing, and I'm not into that. So it was a very negative situation. And of course, then I'm looking at losing my wife at that point. I was 33 or almost 33 with a 2-year-old son. We all lose our spouses at some point, but not usually when you're just starting your life with them. And that was just huge. Like, how do you even face that? And so there was this moment. It was June 30th, 2011. My wife is in bed because that's the only place she really could be. My son was standing in front of me, and we were both looking on at her. And it just hit me. It's like, what in God's name am I doing? What's happening here? I'm standing here with my little boy, who's my everything. He's facing losing his mother, and he's losing his father just at a slower rate. And that is completely and utterly unacceptable. I'm failing him as a father. And that was so powerful and profound and gripping. It really was a light switch moment for me. I woke up the next day feeling completely different about life. And the reason is, in that pain, in that like extremely profound situation, I found the clarity that I had been lacking. And that was my true motivation. And that's the foundation that I teach in the book, is you have to get deep with yourself. And I think that's something a lot of us don't do. I certainly wasn't doing it because I was caught up in all the various things going on in life and this iterative pattern of depressive things going on. And I never took ownership for it. I never had that deep talk with myself, not a pep talk, but a really deep, what I was forced into in that moment is like, what is actually happening here? And what's your hand in it? And you have to be really raw and honest with yourself. And I was, this may sound strange, but I was lucky to have that moment. My wife is still alive. So things changed dramatically for both of us starting with that day. And, I did a podcast with a Navy SEAL who was blown out of his vehicle in the desert and left for dead. And that was his moment. And so when I talk to people like, well, I don't have anything like that. I haven't been, standing there with a gun in my face or been given a death sentence or whatever. So then it's not going to work for me. And that's not true. That can force it. And so maybe I had it easier because it was forced upon me to see that truth. Not everyone's going to see it in a moment like that, but you can get there without having to be, at risk of losing everything. It just means you got to get a lot more raw and honest with yourself. And sometimes that takes help. It might take a coach. It might take a psychiatrist. It might take just a friend who's willing to be honest and call you on your BS and push you harder. And that's the sort of path that I try to help people with in the book and through my own coaching work is we got to dig in a really honest way. But I promise you, there is a motivation in there, and it's the key to unlocking your ability to start, instead of having that negative cycle where one bad thing leads to the next. I say success begets success. And that's what Mr. Andre was doing is whether it's big or small, when you start achieving and you focus on that and you tell yourself a story of achievement, you start going from one win to the next. And that is transformative in a way I think most people have never experienced.
Yeah. I'm glad that you put it in that perspective, or added the perspective, I should say, that there's individuals that are out there, because I've had this conversation as well in my own practice and teaching in the classroom and everything else, of individuals looking at something that you've been through and how that provided such a turning point in your life because you went up against everything. There was a moment where you could have lost everything that was in the world to you at that time. And then they ask, but I haven't had that moment. How do I face it? Because there's so many people that I would love to help them continue to make that shift. That's part of what this podcast is about, is to make that shift without having to go through a moment like that, without having to go to the brink of experiencing something like that, and have much more conscious, proactive control over how we go there, and where you take it to that point of really getting deep within yourself to go into that place that may be racked with some pain and some fear, and to be able to unearth it, to uncover it, to be really honest with yourself, or have somebody who can help you do that, to dive in there, to really understand, what is this really all about for me? Yeah. What is it that matters most? What happens then? You know, at that moment in time, you begin to experience this profound shift. You know it the next day when you wake up. What then begins to unfold that then ultimately leads to Do a Day?
Yeah, so the first thing that I addressed was the physical side, because that was this may not sound real to people, but that was the easiest thing for me to get into. And, you know, with 100 pounds to lose, that's daunting and too much for everyone, but I wasn't losing 100 pounds right here, right now. And when I went to lose weight again, I didn't have 100 pounds to lose. I probably had, I was 222 and I got down to 180, so 42 pounds. I'd set a goal of 185 and I got there faster than I expected, so I kept going. That was much easier to fix than my wife's health, which I can contribute to, but you know, that wasn't a given. It wasn't just like, oh, do these 3 things and then everything's fine, or we would have done that. My job situation was much, much more complex, and I was the sole earner. You know, I couldn't just walk away from my job and you know, we had bills to pay, and right now they were really, really big because of all the medical costs. So the weight, that was the easiest thing to start with. Yeah. And it's also a very empowering thing, and it's a great way to deal with stress. So when I had been working out, but it was very mindless, like, you know, get on the elliptical, watch a show, and oh, it's beeping because it's done. I didn't even know I started. That's that, you know, walk away and I might be sweating. Yeah, it was totally different the next morning. And it was a simple little thing, but I used an interval program. And I couldn't see the intervals if I had there were no iPads at the time. I think my laptop or a magazine or whatever it was that I was distracted with, it was blocking the screen. So I put it away. And I actually paid attention. And when the intervals came, I didn't just go slower, I went harder. And all of a sudden at the end of that workout, I was tired, but I felt energized. And I was like, oh, that's something different. And it's feeding off of this motivation that I felt. I was like, that was the right decision for me. And so I just started to add up these positive choices around my health. And so then Google's a powerful thing. And so I started to look into some dietary choices. And I looked into other exercise ideas to add to my cardio workout. What other things could I put into that? You know, I used to like to lift weights. Well, I don't have a whole gym at my disposal. So what are other things I can do? And it was really simple. I just opened up Excel and I made a little spreadsheet to track what I was doing, which is something I had done with Mr. Andre, but not since. You know, we always had these paper charts, so we'd have to fill in all of the exercises we did. And I liked that. So I'm like, why haven't I been doing it? So I created a framework for accountability and success around my physical fitness. And I got to say that weight started to drop really fast. So I had set a goal of 185 by the end of the year. And I got to tell you, I didn't even know if that was possible. my birthday was that October, and I hit 180 for my birthday.
Wow.
And I was like, go me.
Yeah.
I probably said that. And yeah, it just kept going. And then it was not about losing weight anymore. It was about being happy with myself physically again and having energy despite having a very exhausting life. And my son was getting into it, and he was excited, and he was just 2 years old, so he's always got the energy to go do things, and I didn't have it to do them with him until then. So just that success started to beget success.
So let me pull a few things out of that to kind of tee up then what specifically is Do a Day, because part of what you mentioned before is this idea that success begets success. So you picked something that you knew you could begin to tackle. It would have benefits because it would lower stress. It would raise your energy by going after that exact thing. And once you did, you recognized, I think you said it as feeding off your motivation, but it probably would be, you could even say it as it was feeding your motivation because of the way that it was snowballing into positive results, and you were stacking your positive choices and habits. So like you said, one thing leads to the next. That success begets success, the way in which you were putting it together and combining it together. So with that as the backdrop, tell us, specifically when, your book is titled Do a Day, what does Do a Day mean?
Yeah. So Do a Day in and of itself it's an approach to doing proactive. You said conscious and proactive a moment ago.
Yeah.
So it's a conscious, proactive choice to take action today in support of the goals that you're trying to achieve. And it's not one day at a time, which is to me a very passive kind of weather the storm, just grit your teeth and get through it kind of thing. It's, look, if you want this to happen in your life, what will you do to make that happen? And the day part is also really critical. It's about, I said before with 100 pounds, you're not losing 100 pounds today. And that was the problem every time I looked at it before was, oh my God, this is too much. I'm looking, my wife might die and that's too much. Well, she's not dying this second. I'm not losing 100 pounds this second. I don't have to find the perfect job for the rest of my life and never have to deal with politics or pay the bills or whatever this second. Right now, I have to make a choice that's going to add up to getting through that thing I'm trying to achieve. So right now I need to make some better food choices and better activity choices so that I'm helping myself get to my weight goal, regardless of how long it takes. Right. And I, you listed off a bunch of things in the intro. I've literally used that approach across the board. I was doing a coaching call with someone last night and they're like, well, how do you get through, that tough time? I was like, it sounds cheesy and I'm not trying to sell my book because you already bought it. Right. But that is what I do. I'm not putting out a message that I'm not living myself. And you said I went vegan in a day because literally that's how I do everything. Right. So I had thought about it before. I had read a few biographies or autobiographies by vegan athletes, and I was really intrigued by it. But I was like, I travel for work. What am I going to do with that? That business dinner that everyone wants to go to the steak place, and am I going to have lettuce? What do I do then? And my son's birthday is, it's every year it's going to happen that he's going to want to have cake and he's going to want me to have a piece with him. But if I'm vegan, I can't do that. Yeah. And I just had all of these things that weren't happening right now that I was using as well, what about this? What about that? And it was all just too much. Yeah. So I was reading a book by this vegan ultra athlete, this guy named Rich Roll, who's a huge inspiration in my life. And he was just sort of putting out there, it's like, you don't have any excuses. You should just do it. And I literally said out loud, I can do it tomorrow. I can do a day. And that's literally when the whole thing got a name. Because I just said, it's not anybody's birthday tomorrow. I'm not traveling. I'm going to my office. I tend to get a salad at lunch anyway, so I can control what I eat for breakfast and dinner. Why can't I do this? And it's just a day. So who cares if I do it the day after? Let me at least see if I can get through a day. Yeah. And I just released all of that pressure. You lose a pound, all the 99 other pounds that seem impossible are totally irrelevant. Yeah. So I woke up, I did a day, and then I evaluated how it went. And I found that it was actually a lot easier than all that pressure had made it feel. And you know what? If I screwed up and didn't do it, it's just a day. Right. So I can at least recognize, look, did I do what I wanted to do? No. Why didn't I do that? It's not a get out of jail free card. You don't just let yourself off the hook. But you don't have to wallow in it and feel like a failure, because it's just a day and you can pick up tomorrow and make a different choice to do better. And you understand better now because of that failure.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much great stuff in there. I'll put this in the context of every once in a while we broach that subject of mastery on this show, and part of the way that for the orientation for everybody, when you're seeking to master something, your focus becomes process and progress, not the result. The result that you're looking for, the outcome you're looking for, yes, it's what you orient yourself towards. It is the goal. But you do a day. You focus on what's here, what's now. How can I work my process? How can I look at my progress and not constantly measure yourself against this ideal vision that you have for yourself, which you don't give yourself enough time to go out and achieve.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and also by doing it that way, you really change the perspective of your story. Like you said, you're looking at a day at a time. If something doesn't quite happen the way that you want, it's okay. It was just a day. Yeah. What are we going to do? How do I want to adjust it? What did I learn from that? And it gives you a great sense of being empowered to the type of choices of how you're going to live each day and looking at it that way.
Yeah, exactly.
The one question that I want to sneak in here before we start to wrap up was that I want to go back to this idea of true motivation, because we started to touch on it before, but I didn't want to get through the call without asking you, how is it, because you mentioned a few things in the book, if you just use one or two of those, how is it that you really uncover your true motivation so that people can really find that inner energy that fuels the commitment to make the do a day type of a commitment approach? Sure.
And actually one of the pushbacks I get from people who have not had a near-death experience or something like that and don't have kids is they're like, well, you keep talking about your son. Well, I don't have kids. So I don't have, and it's like, well, that's what's relevant for me. And I know people who have kids who that's not their true motivation, as hard as that is for them to admit.
Yeah.
But I have a few questions that I pose in the book to help people on the journey. The book's not someone's like, well, it didn't give me the answer. It can't give you the answer. Only you can. It's not a workbook. Add these 2 lines up and there's your motivation. You're done. I have some probing questions that you really need to think about. It's not a long book. I don't want you to spend the time with my book. I want you to spend the time with you. So there's 4 questions in there. If I had to boil it down to one, it's a sort of a starter question. It's, what is it that you're always going to care about no matter what? And it's a pretty basic, straightforward question. It's extremely hard to answer, believe it or not. Yeah. And what I found with people that I coach is they come up with an answer pretty quickly, and it's not usually the right answer. And that's where having a coach is helpful, or having someone who you can bounce it off of, who you tell, like, challenge me on it. And you can do this yourself. It's just a little bit harder to be as honest with yourself as, if you have someone to push you along the way. Yeah. But really press yourself. So I had someone I was working with who told me it was their kids, and she had a great story for it, and it fit, and a lot of her life choices really added up. And I was like, I get it. She's like, I'm the main provider for them. It's about my kids, and so I've had to make some choices that I prioritize what happens to my family over necessarily what I would have done if I was alone. And we talked through that, and she was approached about a new job at her current company, but it required her to move. And when she passed on it, because that was going to be too upsetting, destabilizing, all that for her kids, she was in tears and felt a huge loss. And I was like, what are you upset about? She's like, it's not really about the job. It's the fact that I'm upset about it, because does that mean I'm a bad mother? Yeah. And I was like, what you're dancing around here is not that you're a bad mother. It's that either your true motivation isn't quite how you put it, and it may still be around your family, but maybe you're not fully understanding what it means. Or maybe that is your motivation, but you need to have more compassion for yourself, that just because that's your reason, it doesn't mean that you're not going to get upset from time to time. Right. You still made the choice that you made, which means your priorities are still as you said they are, but you can still feel a loss. Yeah. If you feel a loss and you're angry about it, or you're blaming your kids for it, or your husband, or your whatever, that's a different story. Then that's not motivation. That's a barrier, or that's a constraint that you're unhappy about. Yeah. But don't frame that as your motivation. And that's where, having someone to talk through that with can be really valuable because you need someone to press you. And that's most of the coaching work I do with people is to just push them on their own honesty. It's not for me. Mm-hmm. You don't owe me an answer. That's not going to change anything about my life. It's, it's use me as a surrogate for yourself, really.
Exactly.
Having to do that self-homework.
Yeah.
You feel a bit of accountability to me, but at the end of the day, I'm still going to do what I'm going to do, and I'm going to sleep fine tonight. It's for you in your life, but you need to be honest about it.
And I think you're spot on, because a lot of the initial answers that we give to some of these deep questions are truly they're more surface than we would care to look at, and they usually stem from being the rational answer. Mm-hmm. And the true motivation is not rational. It comes from a much deeper place. It's more emotional. It's more heart-centered. And being able to peel that back and ask, well, what's the motivation beneath that? What's really actually underneath that? What's underneath that? And really being able to peel that back. It may still, like you said, it may still be around your family or your kids if that's part of the guiding light for you. And at the same time, the way in which you care for them, the way in which you're motivated by them may be very different the more that you peel back those layers. And that's, I think you just did a wonderful job of describing how that unfolds. Bryan, I think we could probably go on for quite some time, but let me start to wrap up with just these couple of questions. I'd love to just hear from you at this point. What would you say matters most to you in your life and work?
Yeah, so it's still always going to be about my son, and ultimately the choices that I make, the actions that I take, how I am mindful about how that impacts him. And that doesn't mean I always do right, but it does mean that I'm going to have some thinking to do afterward to try to understand whether it fits in or not. And that's something my wife's great about calling me on, is like, how would you want Michael to look at you for that? Or how would you want, him to think about what you just did? I was like, that's a really good point. Yeah. And we all get caught up. I'm reading a lot about Buddhism, and it's this great book by the Dalai Lama that I'm reading that he even says himself, he struggles with meditation at times. And it's like, no way.
Really?
Yeah.
Exactly.
And maybe he's just saying that, but, it's like nobody's perfect. Yeah. Nobody has it easy. People who sound perfect probably aren't. Like, that's one thing I've learned is I struggle too. The grass is not green anywhere, despite how it may look, and that's completely fine. It's about trying to stay on that focus of what's my motivation, which is him. And, what am I doing in relation to that? What's the example I'm setting? How am I supporting him? What kind of life am I creating for him? That's ultimately what it's about for me.
And then I guess just to sum up, what would you say is your meaningful way?
Yeah, this is going to sound fake, but it's do a day. Yeah. It has to be.
It was a layup. Come on.
Yeah. It's just the way that I found, if I'm going to do what I want to do and do it with the emotional positivity and freedom that I know I deserve to have, then I have to do it that way, because there's too much you can get caught up in judging yourself on. There's too much you can fear, and it's not necessary, because that's not getting you anywhere. Yeah. So I really do try to live my own philosophy on a daily basis. And, there's course corrections from time to time, but that's my meaningful way.
Excellent. Bryan, I want to thank you for coming on The Meaningful Way, sharing everything that you have. Actually, just before I totally wrap up with you, I do want to also thank you for, and I got to share it to thank you for this. Bryan has also offered everybody I would very strongly encourage you, number one, to check out Do a Day and check out the book. It's like Bryan said, it's actually not a long read. I found it very, very accessible. You can read it relatively quick, but there's a lot of really meaningful questions and dialogue that is within the book to dive into. And so Bryan arranged to give a meaningful discount to everybody. So to take advantage of that, save, I think it was $4 off the book, go to doadaybook.com/meaningful discount. And I'll include that link in the show notes as well. So for the discount, but more importantly for the experience, the stories, the wisdom, and the insights, Bryan, that you shared today, I want to thank you so much for coming on The Meaningful Way.
Oh, thanks for having me. This was such a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. And for everybody, I want to encourage you. This might even be an episode to go back and listen to a couple of times, because I want you to get really clear on how is it that you're going to investigate that true motivation for you, how you're going to peel back those layers and really unearth that fuel that is going to carry you through to the things that you truly want most in this life. And those are not material things. Those are experiential things. They are the joy, the peace, the freedom that we wish to have in this life. And I would encourage you to take a look at the book, take a look at the process of Do a Day, because when we break this down into a daily focus, that's actually where we usually make the most meaningful progress. And so, as always, thank you so much for joining us on this episode. And until next time, continue to enjoy the journey. Thanks for tuning in to The Meaningful Way. If you enjoyed this episode, do me a favor and please subscribe and follow along with all these great guests, their stories, and interviews. Also, it helps us a lot if you not only share some of your favorite episodes online, but also provide us feedback. Go into iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever your favorite podcast app happens to be, and rate the show. Provide us some feedback and let us know how it is that we're doing. If you want to learn more about what we're up to, whether it be with the iPet Coach Training School, the Live, Lead, Play Network, or even just what's evolving with The Meaningful Way, go on and head on over to lukeiorio.com.